Marvin Grayson didn't move into the neighborhood for the community or the view. He wasn't looking for fresh starts, friendly block parties, or golf carts humming past manicured lawns. He chose that house for one reason only: logistics. One floor, direct access to the porch, good air circulation, and a covered entry with enough room to accommodate his oxygen equipment. At 67, Marvin had no desire to impress anyone, and he certainly wasn't in the business of making friends. After being diagnosed with idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, he learned fast that every breath had a cost, and he paid it daily. His house wasn't a retirement haven. It was a controlled zone of survival. The home, an unassuming ranch-style place on a quiet curve in a high-regulation community, had all the markers of respectability: tan siding, a 2-car garage, perfectly spaced shrubs. But to Marvin, it was nothing more than square footage with a ramp and a reinforced HVAC system. He spent most of his days inside, slowly moving from room to room, keeping his pulse oximeter clipped to his finger like a silent metronome. When he sat outside, which he tried to do at least once a day, he brought his oxygen tanks with him. Always. They were placed neatly on a mobile stand next to the rocking chair on his front porch. A simple canvas curtain partially shielded them from view, though Marvin never thought of hiding them. To him, they were as ordinary as a mailbox. They weren't decorations. They were a lifeline. In his younger days, Marvin had worked as a logistics coordinator for international aid projects, crisis zones, refugee camps, food scarcity hotbeds. He'd been in the thick of some of the world's worst human disasters and had learned the art of surviving chaos with silence, patience, and an intimate knowledge of how systems fail. He never talked about it now. People in the suburbs didn't understand systems. They just followed them. That was what worried him. These people were obsessed with rules they didn't even write, and even more obsessed with enforcing them on others. He kept to himself, didn't cause trouble, paid his dues. His medical setup was cleared with his doctor and registered under ADA compliance. He'd even filed documentation with the neighborhood management company when he moved in, not because he believed in their authority, but because it was easier to submit papers once than argue for months. At first, everything was quiet. The lawn got mowed, the garbage collected, the mail delivered. No one knocked, no one waved. That suited him just fine. Until Karen Dodson arrived. She came in like a whisper on vinyl heels, polished, composed, and overprepared. The type of woman who never touched a doorknob without sanitizing it, who wore sunglasses even when it rained. She'd inherited her late husband's house 2 streets down, and within weeks of her arrival, she had maneuvered her way into the presidency of the neighborhood board, a position she described at length in a letter she circulated herself. Marvin had read it with a kind of dark amusement. It was filled with the kind of language that sounded polite but landed like a slap. Streamlining visual cohesion, enhancing external uniformity, preserving neighborhood excellence. He knew the type. She didn't want order, she wanted obedience. And, most dangerously, she wanted to be seen as the one who could enforce it. He'd spotted her once or twice, walking briskly in the mornings with a clipboard tucked under one arm and her cell phone in the other. Always in a suit. Always assessing. She never looked at him directly, but he could feel it. Her glance grazing over the porch, the stand, the tubing, the visible tank. It didn't take long for the letter to arrive. It was folded precisely into thirds and delivered by hand, no envelope. She had even signed it personally with a little blue ink flourish. Dear Mr. Grayson, it has come to our attention that certain items currently displayed on the exterior of your property may not be in compliance with our updated community visual standards. In particular, The oxygen canisters and related medical equipment visible from the street may create an impression inconsistent with the character of our neighborhood. We respectfully request that such items be relocated to a less visible location within 10 days to maintain aesthetic consistency. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation. Warm regards, Karen Dodson Board. President Marvin read it once, then again, slower. He blinked hard, unsure whether to laugh or let his blood pressure rise. Inconsistent with the character of the neighborhood. What character exactly? The character of cloned facades and plastic flower pots, of invisible people living quiet lives while pretending their houses weren't prisons with manicured lawns. He sat down, wheezing slightly, and reached for his oxygen mask. The hum of air kicked on, gentle and essential. He didn't respond immediately. He didn't throw the letter away, either. Instead, he called his doctor, explained what was happening, and requested a formal note, detailing why the oxygen tanks must remain outside and accessible at all times. He sent that note, along with his ADA registration and a copy of the original approval forms, to the board's email address, which, unsurprisingly, Karen monitored directly. No reply came, not even an automated confirmation. Days passed. Then the electricity shut off. It was a Tuesday. No wind, no storm, no warning. He'd been sitting in the living room, watching a documentary with the sound off, when the room went dark. The backup alarm on his oxygen concentrator started its shrill beeping immediately. Marvin knew the drill. He switched over to one of the backup tanks on the porch, calmly and without panic. Years of field work had trained him to avoid panic. It wasted energy and oxygen. But his hands trembled slightly, more from disbelief than fear. He called the power company. After a half-hour of hold music, a man named Jake explained that the shutoff had been processed by request. Marvin's request. Except he hadn't made one. When he asked for details, Jake paused, then mumbled something about system updates and third-party account access. Marvin hung up, not trusting himself to speak further. He didn't yell. He didn't slam the phone. He just sat there, the oxygen mask snug against his face, breathing in and out, long and slow, like a man counting down the seconds to something inevitable. The lights came back on that evening. No explanation, no apology. But something had shifted. He'd been tolerant, quiet, and deliberately invisible. But now he was being pushed, not by accident, but by decision. Someone had orchestrated this, manipulated a utility, risked his health, and done so without fear of consequence. That wasn't negligence. That was calculation. And Marvin Grayson had spent too many years in the worst corners of the world not to recognize a power move when he saw one. The game had started, and he hadn't even made his first move yet. The next morning, Marvin did what he always did when the air felt tense. He made coffee and pretended the world hadn't shifted. The mug warmed his hand as he moved around the kitchen, slower than he used to, slower than he liked. The oxygen tubing hissed softly from the tank beside him, trailing behind like a tether. Outside, the street was unnervingly quiet. No lawnmowers, no barking dogs, just the occasional hum of a passing car. The silence felt less like peace and more like anticipation. Something hung in the atmosphere, unsaid but deliberately placed. He walked out to the porch and settled into the rocker, setting the mug down carefully on the armrest. The air was cool, the kind of cool that irritated his lungs but felt clean. He adjusted the tubing, took a long breath, and let the chair move slowly. Across the street, a man watered his hedge while glancing up at Marvin's house more than necessary. That wasn't new, but now there was an edge to it, a kind of studied disinterest that betrayed real curiosity. People here didn't like disruption, and Marvin had become one. Not loud, not aggressive, just visible in a way they didn't like. Medical equipment on a porch reminded them of things they didn't want to think about. Fragility, illness, mortality. It punctured their illusion of perfection. That's what the letter had really meant. Not about aesthetic cohesion or external uniformity. No, that was all code. What they really meant was, "You're making us uncomfortable." And now that he hadn't complied, he could feel the mood turning. Not open hostility. Something worse. Passive control. Polite punishment. At noon, a maintenance truck stopped at the far end of the street. Two men stepped out, one of them holding a tablet. They glanced toward Marvin's property, muttered to each other, then moved to the community panel by the sidewalk, the junction box that controlled a good chunk of the utilities for the east end of the neighborhood. Marvin noticed, not because they were doing anything visibly illegal, but because they were too casual. No cones, no markings, no work orders displayed, and they were there less than 5 minutes. By late afternoon, the power flickered again. This time it came back on within seconds, but the lights had dimmed. His concentrator buzzed louder than usual. The backup battery unit he kept in the bedroom emitted a single chirp, brief but pointed. Marvin knew that sound. It only happened when voltage dropped below threshold. He checked the panel inside the house. Voltage irregular. No circuit failure. That wasn't an accident. Someone had manipulated the current at the source. He didn't waste time on speculation. He opened his laptop, pulled up the contact information for his legal advisor, not a full lawyer, but a retired compliance consultant who had helped him with ADA filings in the past. He wrote a message outlining the events so far. The letter, the sudden power loss, the maintenance activity. Nothing accusatory, just a factual chain of events with timestamps and details. He attached a copy of the doctor's note, the prior approval document, and the text of the original HOA response, word for word. Then he sent it and waited. 30 minutes later, the reply came back short, but telling. Not your imagination. Document everything. I'll draft a preliminary response. Don't escalate, but don't disengage. So he did. Marvin started keeping a log. He time-stamped power fluctuations, tracked any new activity on the street, even recorded when neighbors slowed their walks in front of his house. It was all circumstantial, but when you dealt with systems of quiet control, you learned to spot patterns before they got loud. 2 days later, a flyer was slipped under his door. Not mailed, not handed to him, just slid quietly across the welcome mat like an afterthought. It announced a special community forum on maintaining visual integrity and neighborhood standards. No mention of Marvin, no mention of oxygen tanks, but the subtext screamed off the page. The meeting was to be held at the local clubhouse, led by Karen herself. There would be open discussion, examples presented, and clarification of updated compliance zones. Marvin knew that phrasing, too. It meant they were preparing to make his case public without using his name, to shame without confrontation. He had no intention of attending. Instead, he contacted the local energy provider again, this time requesting formal logs of all service interruptions and voltage adjustments tied to his address. He didn't expect full compliance, but surprisingly, a young technician named Marisa called back personally. She spoke quickly, her tone neutral but not indifferent. I pulled the reports. Technically, nothing was marked as an outage, but there's a pattern. Voltage dips tied to signal changes at your transformer. That's rare. Only happens with manual override. Marvin asked what that meant exactly. It means someone's remotely altering flow. Not enough to shut you down, but enough to mess with sensitive equipment. Normally, we flag that. But this one's been masked. Whoever accessed it had administrative clearance through a third-party management portal. He asked if she could trace it. No, but I can file an internal audit request. Won't be immediate, but it's something. Marvin thanked her, saved her name, and added the conversation to his log. That night, his front yard sprinklers activated at 2 a.m. He hadn't set them, and they hadn't been on for weeks. They stayed on for 30 full minutes, flooding the garden bed and soaking the walkway. The next morning, a citation appeared in his mailbox. Improper water usage during restricted hours, Tier 2 violation. It came with a warning of escalating fines. He laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the pettiness had become theatrical. It wasn't just enforcement, it was performance. Someone was choreographing every step. That meant they were scared, or at least determined, and that in its own way gave him an advantage. Because when you know the pattern, you can interrupt it. He didn't retaliate, not yet. Instead, he went to the city building department and requested a public access appointment. Under ADA law, he had a right to certain infrastructural accommodations and protections. He wasn't filing a complaint, he was doing a checkup, and he made sure that appointment was visible, documented, and on record. It was the kind of bureaucratic move no one expected from an old man with a tank, and that was exactly why it worked. Back at home, he adjusted the oxygen tank position on his porch. Not to hide it, the opposite. He elevated it on a pedestal, still within safety code, and added a laminated note. Life support equipment, registered and approved. Do not obstruct. Then he sat back in his chair, tubing secure, hands folded, and waited. Not out of fear, but out of knowledge. Because now, the next move wouldn't be quiet. It would have to be public. And when they tried, it would be their overstep, not his. And they would try. Because people like Karen always did. 3 days passed without another letter, without a second knock, without even the familiar flicker in the power. It should have felt like a reprieve, but Marvin didn't buy it. He knew what silence meant in situations like this. It wasn't surrender. It was staging. He could sense the momentum of something gathering beneath the surface. There were too many little things out of place. The garbage collection skipped his house without explanation. The recycling bin left tipped on its side. His lawn slightly overwatered despite having disabled the timer. But what confirmed it, what truly told him the next phase had begun, came on a Saturday afternoon when a city code enforcement officer knocked on his door. She introduced herself as Officer Winfield, badge on display, clipboard in hand, face neutral and courteous. She said she was there to follow up on a complaint regarding non-compliant medical storage and unauthorized exterior installations. Her voice didn't accuse, but her presence did. Marvin didn't let frustration show. He invited her in with steady calm, gestured to the porch where the oxygen tank stood as they always had, anchored, labeled, and shielded by regulation fabric. He showed her the documentation, the doctor's letter, the ADA compliance forms, the digital correspondence. She nodded, took notes, snapped photos, not of him, but of the setup, the porch, the property line. When she left, she said something strange. Not to threaten, but to suggest. "It's usually not this thorough," she said, tapping the clipboard. "Someone wants a paper trail." He didn't ask who. He thanked her, closed the door, and exhaled slowly, the mask tight to his face. That night, the lights in his house dimmed for the third time in 2 weeks. The backup alarm beeped once, short but sharp. He noted the timestamp. Then he walked to the kitchen and opened the drawer where he kept his old-field notebook. It was battered, nearly falling apart, but still usable. He began a new page with a date, underlined it, and wrote one line beneath. External escalation confirmed. The next morning, he stepped outside and found the first real signal of aggression. Not a notice, not a flyer, a structure. Someone had installed a brand new sign on the grass strip between the sidewalk and his yard. Community property. The sign was glossy, mounted on a steel pole. Its message printed in clean, authoritative font. Medical equipment must remain indoors. Community Health and Visual Safety Ordinance, Section 14.7. Noncompliance subject to daily citation. Beneath it, smaller print read, Approved by Neighborhood Safety Committee, Fort 26. There was no Ordinance 14.7 in the city's public code. Marvin knew because he checked the database within 15 minutes. There was also no Neighborhood Safety Committee registered with the city or county. What this was, plain and simple, was a bluff wearing the mask of bureaucracy. And, bluff or not, it worked, because 2 different neighbors crossed the street rather than pass in front of his house that day. One of them even looked apologetic. Marvin didn't take the sign down. He left it standing, photographed it from 3 angles, then sent the images to his legal contact, who replied, "This isn't a warning. It's a provocation. Let's treat it as such." 2 days later, things turned from strange to strategic. A maintenance crew arrived. 4 men, matching uniforms, 1 unmarked truck. They said they were there to perform a load balance survey on the utility lines near Marvin's home. They claimed it was part of a scheduled audit, but Marvin had seen enough staged surveys in war zones to recognize when a crew was on site for something other than what they claimed. He didn't interfere. He watched from the porch. The men didn't enter his property, but they walked the edge. One of them pointed toward the side of his house, toward the oxygen lines that trailed to the backup tanks and then disappeared beneath the siding. Another jotted notes. 10 minutes later, they left without comment, but that night, Marvin noticed something new. One of the backup tanks had a scrape across the brass fitting, thin but deliberate. It didn't compromise the tank, but it could have. If you didn't know what you were doing, you wouldn't have known it was there. If you did, you would have known how to make it worse. He didn't call the police. He called his old contact at the supply company, an engineer he'd once helped during a humanitarian deployment. Within 24 hours, a technician came out under the pretense of equipment check, replaced the valve, and installed a tamper tag on each unit. Marvin didn't ask him to report it. He just wanted it on record that he took steps. The kind you take before someone accuses you of negligence for sabotage they caused. The next week brought the formal notice from the board. Not Karen herself, but through a law firm representing the Community Oversight Committee, a group that had never existed prior to that letter. The notice accused Marvin of endangering neighborhood residents by maintaining hazardous pressurized devices in public view, and demanded he relocate all tanks indoors within 5 business days. It included a threat of daily fines and possible removal of equipment by community-approved contractors under Emergency Safety Authority. Marvin didn't reply directly. Instead, his consultant filed a counter-notice with the city clerk's office and copied the regional ADA Compliance Bureau. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't accuse. It stated clearly that any attempt to remove life-sustaining equipment without court order or medical override would constitute not just civil liability, but criminal endangerment. Then they sent copies of that filing to the board's law firm and to Karen's personal address, which he had previously used in HOA correspondence. No one responded, but someone acted. On the morning of the 5th day, Marvin awoke to find a large utility van parked in front of his home, hazard lights blinking. 2 men stood near the porch, one holding a work order, the other preparing tools. Marvin opened the door and asked them what they were doing. The taller man, polite but firm, said they had a request to perform, gas line inspection related to outdoor apparatus. Marvin said no such request existed, and no such work would proceed without city paperwork. The man paused, looked at the work order, and nodded once. They packed up and left without argument. But later that day, Marvin found an envelope taped to his garage door. Inside was a photo, grainy, low resolution of him on the porch, oxygen tank at his side, mask fitted to his face. Across the bottom, someone had written in block letters, "Keep bringing attention, and we'll bring the code." That night, he didn't sleep. Not out of fear, but clarity. They were making it personal now. Not about rules, not even about control. They wanted submission, silence, erasure. Marvin had seen this before. Systems that forced compliance not by law, but by pressure, by stripping away safe options until obedience was the only path that didn't cost you your breath. Except he wasn't built for submission. He made one phone call. Not to the city, not to the board. He called an old acquaintance from a private firm specializing in regulatory diagnostics. Men who used to audit failing infrastructure in unstable countries, now working domestic contracts for municipalities, trying to avoid lawsuits. Marvin asked him one question. "Can you tell me where the power to this neighborhood is centralized, and who owns it?" The man hesitated, then said he'd call back in a day. When he did, his answer was precise. There was a secondary substation half a mile away, maintained by a third-party vendor subcontracted through the board's maintenance committee. It wasn't city-owned. It wasn't even directly monitored. It operated on a remote relay that could be accessed by a select group with codes granted during initial installation. The firm who installed it no longer operated in the area. Hypothetically, Marvin asked, if that relay were tripped manually? The man was quiet. Homes east of Ashwood Drive would lose service for up to 12 hours, depending on how fast someone noticed. Marvin thanked him, wrote it down. Then he stood on his porch, in full view of the street, beside his tank, mask in place, and waited, rocking slowly, his silence louder than any threat he could make. Marvin had never thought of himself as a man prone to ritual, but lately everything in his day began and ended on the porch. It was where he checked his breath, adjusted his dosage, and watched the neighborhood make its slow, deliberate motions. But on the day everything turned, he never sat down. He stood, still, rooted, watching. At precisely 10:06 a.m., a black sedan rolled into the neighborhood, too sleek for a contractor, too expensive for a city employee, and far too early for a casual visitor. It passed Marvin's house twice before parking at the far end of the street near the community green. A man stepped out, short-sleeved shirt, pressed slacks, clipboard in hand. He walked with a smooth efficiency, pausing at intervals to look down at a small device strapped to his wrist, something like a tablet, but smaller, specialized. He wasn't here to inspect, he was here to confirm. Marvin turned and went back inside, oxygen tank trailing behind. He opened his laptop and checked the status of his utility logs. The software he'd installed, nothing illegal, just a monitor for his own household flow, showed something he hadn't seen before. Activity. A query ping. Someone had remotely accessed the smart meter on his property at 10:03 a.m., then again at 10:05. A third ping appeared as he watched, 10:08 a.m. He clicked Details. The pings weren't from his energy provider. They were from a third-party management platform labeled Nova Grid. He recognized the name. 2 years ago, Nova had been the contractor assigned to streamline the neighborhood's energy monitoring for sustainability purposes, according to one of Karen's earlier newsletters. Marvin had ignored it then. Sustainability in these parts usually meant LED light bulbs and a new recycling bin. But now it was clear they hadn't just digitized the data. They'd handed over access. Someone could now monitor and manipulate residential utilities in real time, and, based on his logs, they already had. He forwarded the screenshot to his consultant, included the timestamp, and sent a second copy to the contact at the diagnostics firm. Then he picked up his phone and called Marisa, the technician who had warned him before. She answered, quiet, cautious. "I need you to confirm something," Marvin said. "Has Nova Grid been given override privileges on residential feeds?" There was silence on the line. Then, "Not officially, but they built the bridge. The board asked for full integration. It was approved without public review." "Can they shut me down? If they claim it's for safety, or if they mark your system as unresponsive or foreign hardware, most people wouldn't even know it happened." Marvin thanked her, closed the call, and sat back in his chair. It was never about the tank. It was never about the porch. They were setting up a mechanism of erasure, not in broad daylight, not with confrontation, but by simply toggling his access to power, visibility, and voice. And they had almost succeeded. Almost. That afternoon, he left the house for the first time in days. Not to run, not to hide, but to drive. He followed the route his contact had mapped out. Past the school, past the public library, past the new housing development they were calling the Reserve. 2 left turns later, he found it. A squat, concrete structure partially obscured by trees and hedges, no signage, no fencing, just a single locked panel on a steel frame. The Nova Relay. It looked like a utility box. It wasn't. This was the control point for half the area's automated regulation. He didn't approach. He didn't touch it. He took a photo from the sidewalk, noted the cameras. 2 of them, dome type, cheap, with no active motion light. Then he left, knowing full well they would log the vehicle. He wanted them to, because now this wasn't about violation. This was about witness. He returned home before sunset. On his porch, a single slip of paper waited beneath the mat. No envelope, no signature. Just one line, typed in a clean font. "You've made your position clear. We'll proceed accordingly." He didn't go inside. He stayed on the porch, eyes scanning the corners of the street. At 8:14 p.m., the lights across the road flickered, then went out completely. Not his, theirs. By 8:19, 2 trucks appeared, different from before, marked this time. Neighborhood Technical Services. They worked fast. 5 men. New panel opened, new relay plugged in. And all the while, Marvin sat silently, the hum of his oxygen concentrator steady as a heartbeat. At 9:02 p.m., the power returned to the other homes. At 9:05, the front of Marvin's house blinked dark. He didn't move, because his backup unit kicked in instantly, because he'd known this was coming, and because earlier that week, Marvin Grayson had filed a formal declaration with the state's Utility Oversight Agency, accompanied by technical documentation, timestamps, and a notarized statement from a diagnostics auditor who confirmed Power modulation had occurred illegally and without customer consent. And now, the first act of interference had just become evidence. Midpoint wasn't always a climax. Sometimes it was a shift. And now, the shift had come. The battle was no longer about whether Marvin would yield. It was about whether they could afford to continue trying to make him. And the answer was slowly, carefully becoming no. The blackout lasted 16 minutes. Not long enough to kill anything, not short enough to be dismissed. Marvin's concentrator ran on the backup battery like it had 100 times in training simulations and twice before in real life. He sat in the same chair, hands folded over the tubing, gaze steady on the street in front of him. Every light on the block had returned, except his. And that was the point. It wasn't about electricity. It was about signal. Message sent, message received. He didn't move to the breaker panel. He didn't call the city. Instead, he stood slowly, disconnecting from the battery just long enough to switch tanks, securing the portable oxygen on his shoulder with practiced care. Then he walked through the house, each step deliberate, and entered the spare room that had once been an office and had over the past month become a bunker of sorts. Files, documentation, printed emails, a backup drive, and a dedicated laptop that never connected to the home network. From that machine, he opened a secure channel. Not a hotline, not a whistleblower site, but a shared database used by civic watchdogs and retired compliance officers. He uploaded the voltage logs, the screenshots of unauthorized ping queries, the time-lapse from his front-facing camera showing the utility trucks, and the footage of the lights going out on his block, one by one, until only his remained dark. Then he sent a short email to 3 people, none of whom were neighbors, none of whom were friends, but all of whom had titles and a long-standing dislike of regulatory abuses. A former state auditor, a current deputy in the Office of Utility Ethics, and a journalist he'd never met but had read religiously for 5 years. The subject line was brief. Targeted residential infrastructure manipulation. Urgent. Then he shut the laptop, reconnected to his concentrator, and returned to the porch. The next morning, he received an email from the Office of Utility Ethics. It wasn't from a secretary or an auto-response system. It was from the deputy himself. Marvin had never met the man, but he recognized the name immediately. Gerard Rooker. Former military, former internal affairs, known for being methodical and quiet, but famously tenacious. The message read, "Mr. Grayson, I've reviewed your materials. This appears to constitute a deliberate bypass of standard utility protocol under false administrative pretenses. I've opened a preliminary inquiry and requested a log audit from the third-party maintenance provider. Do not engage further. If additional interference occurs, contact this number directly." He attached a secure phone line and a contact code. Marvin read the message twice, then leaned back, letting the hum of the machine beside him fill the room. For the first time since the first notice arrived, he felt something approximating weight shift. Not a win, but momentum. That night, a motion light on his driveway failed to trigger. It wasn't broken. The bulbs were new. But the sensor had been angled downward, as if nudged by something that passed too close. In the morning, the lawn was perfectly cut, yet Marvin hadn't hired service in 2 weeks. Whoever did it trimmed only the front strip, the part visible from the street, and left a folded envelope near the sprinkler valve. Inside, a printed form, unsigned, indicating a voluntary review, had been initiated to assess his compliance with evolving community stability guidelines. At the bottom, a fine print clause. Failure to respond may result in corrective engagement. He scanned it, archived it, and reported it. 2 days later, the noise began. Not the kind you call the police for, the subtle kind. It started with a low, rhythmic thumping, barely audible, felt more than heard. At first he thought it was his own heartbeat echoing strangely in the tubing. Then he realized it came only at night, after 10, and always from beneath the back wall. Not the front, not the street-facing side, the part of the property that bordered the narrow maintenance alleyway where only contractors had access. He checked the perimeter, found nothing, but the next evening it returned. Subtle, measured, like a soft hammer against a pipe. He installed a sound logger. The pattern was precise, 2 seconds between each pulse, lasting 6 minutes, ending exactly at midnight. 3 nights in a row. He sent the audio to Rooker. The reply came in 10 hours later. Pattern is artificial, not random noise, interference consistent with signal jamming or low-frequency agitation. Investigating source. Do not retaliate. Retaliation was the part Marvin had been thinking about, not out of anger, but out of necessity. The Nova relay, the one hidden behind hedges outside the subdivision, was not technically guarded. It was not technically off-limits either, due to a lapse in zoning paperwork that placed it in a public easement. It wasn't fenced, wasn't alarmed, and wasn't connected to a live monitor. It simply existed, assumed unimportant by the people who used it, and untouchable by those who didn't know it could be. Marvin knew better. He went at night, not in a disguise, not with a weapon, but with a clipboard, a high-visibility vest, and a laminated notice that read, System Diagnostic Contractual Review in Progress. He placed the sign beside the unit and stood for a full minute before moving. Not to fool cameras, there were none, but to create the illusion of procedure. Then he opened the panel using a master key cut from a model provided to him legally during a diagnostics training he'd attended 5 years ago, and only because he'd registered for infrastructure awareness as part of his disability certification program. Inside, it was simple. 2 simple. 1 central breaker, 2 auxiliary relays. A single port labeled Manual Override Local. He didn't touch anything yet. He just photographed everything. Labeling, serial numbers, switch positions, voltage logs. The breaker's status read, Override Enabled, Remote Priority. That was what told him everything. He could have tripped the breaker. He could have killed the override. Instead, he did what he knew would be far more effective. He disconnected 1 cable. Not a power cable. A data line. The relay would stay active, the homes would remain powered, but the logging system, the one Nova used to track usage, compliance, activity, would go dark. It would look like a glitch, like a hiccup in telemetry. But it would force a manual review. And that meant someone would have to come out. And when they did, they would trigger every piece of Marvin's setup. Motion sensors, cameras, directional microphones. He left the relay untouched beyond that. Reattached the panel. Took the sign with him. 2 days passed. Then came the meeting. Unannounced. Not on the newsletter. Not posted online. But at 6:15 p.m. on a Friday, a collection of folding chairs appeared on the community lawn. Karen arrived in a cream pantsuit. A man beside her read from a prepared statement, something about preserving tranquility and ensuring collective harmony. Words that meant nothing, spoken to people who weren't really listening. Marvin didn't attend. He watched from inside, curtains parted just enough. No one said his name. But 2 people, neighbors, glanced at his house during the speech. And then Karen said something that made the air shift. Sometimes, in order to keep a community healthy, we must make choices that don't feel good but are necessary. Safety doesn't always wait for consensus. That night, his water pressure dropped by 30%. The utility company had no record of an outage, but the main valve near the curb had been turned a quarter rotation. The metal handle still bore the mark of fresh glove prints. He didn't report it. Instead, he filed a final declaration, through his consultant, through Rooker, and through the journalist. The piece published online first, with diagrams and logs embedded. Then, in the Sunday print edition, the headline was simple: Silencing Breath, How a Community Targeted a Medically Vulnerable Resident in the Name of Aesthetic Compliance. Karen didn't speak to the press, but she did attend an emergency board session 2 days later, and when she left, she didn't return. A white sign appeared on her lawn the next week. For sale by owner. Marvin didn't comment. He didn't gloat. He simply moved the tank 2 inches forward on the porch, just enough to catch the light, just enough to make sure everyone could see it. The calm that followed the article's release was not peace. It was recoil. For 3 days, the neighborhood existed in a suspended quiet, as though everyone were collectively holding their breath, unsure which direction to lean, afraid to be seen near either side of the fracture. Marvin watched it unfold not with triumph, but with the grim understanding of a man who had seen systems crack before. He'd learned long ago that exposure didn't end a structure, it only revealed what it was willing to protect. And sometimes that protection came at the cost of those who pulled back the curtain. Karen's absence from the community was sudden, but not total. Her house sat dark, the blinds drawn, but her name still appeared in internal emails, leaked to Marvin by a sympathetic board member who'd previously kept silent. Though she had relinquished her official role, she remained active behind the scenes, issuing instructions through intermediaries, trying to reclaim influence without visibility. She had learned something, though, something crucial. Direct control brought risk. Influence cloaked in delegation could strike just as deeply, but without fingerprints. Marvin saw it happening again in subtler forms. Policy memos began circulating. Drafts at first, then semi-official notices tucked into community bulletins, mentioning ongoing evaluations of non-traditional exterior modifications and potential revisions to legacy accommodations. The language was sanitized, but the implication was clear. The board, or what was left of it, was maneuvering to rewrite the narrative. They could not undo what was published, but they could try to redefine the conversation around it. The strategy was simple. Don't fight the truth. Surround it with new terminology until it became just one version of events among many. What they didn't expect, however, was Marvin's next move. He filed a motion. Not with the board, not with the utility company, with the Office of Regulatory Equity, a little-known state body with limited enforcement power but very real investigatory teeth. His submission included a formal request for review of all energy-based discrimination claims within residential zones governed by private infrastructure. It wasn't personal in tone. It was procedural, objective. It did not mention Karen's name or Nova Grid. It merely laid out a systemic pattern of abuse, backed by logs, diagrams, and first-hand documentation. And it named the relay system that had, until recently, allowed a private actor to selectively modulate access to a resident's basic life support infrastructure. The response came faster than he expected. An investigator, Erica Thomas, mid-40s, sharp eyes behind understated glasses, arrived unannounced, armed with a badge, a thermal scanner, and a digital key that let her access both Marvin's utility port and, more critically, the relay unit itself. She didn't ask for his side of the story. She had already read it. Instead, she asked a single question. "Is it still active?" Marvin answered with a nod. "Hasn't been touched since the last tamper." She checked the relay personally. 2 hours later, she returned to his house, her expression unreadable. Override function was not just active. It was scheduled. Someone had a standing command loop set to target voltage thresholds every 72 hours. It's not just manipulation. That's predictive suppression. "What does that mean?" Marvin asked, though he already knew. "It means someone planned for you to escalate and designed the system to punish you incrementally each time you resisted." She paused. "It's criminal under Revised Code 438. That's electrical harassment. And if we find confirmation it was done by someone without explicit utility license." Marvin waited. "Then it becomes a felony." She stayed in town for 3 more days. During that time, 2 more homes experienced accidental outages. One for 7 minutes, one for 15. Both had owners who had, according to local chatter, spoken up in favor of Marvin at the board's emergency meeting. Erica visited them too, quietly, respectfully. And by the end of the week, the state filed a formal complaint against Nova Grid's local operations. Not a lawsuit, not yet, but an audit order, immediate, unannounced. The moment came on a Tuesday. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It began with the sound of tires, bigger than a car, slower than a truck. 3 white vans pulled into the neighborhood before 9 a.m., each one marked with the seal of the Office of Regulatory Equity. Technicians exited, carrying gear, document cases, and scanners. One of them, flanked by 2 observers, walked directly to the relay unit. They didn't ask permission. They didn't notify the board. Within minutes, the override was disabled, the port sealed, and the unit tagged with a yellow inspection sticker that glowed like a warning flare. An hour later, Erica visited Marvin again. She handed him a document, short, plain, with one sentence highlighted in blue. "This residence has been confirmed as a targeted recipient of unauthorized energy control procedures in violation of state code." It was signed, sealed, and notarized. Not quite vindication, not yet victory, but it was law. That afternoon, a local reporter came to the house asking for a quote. Marvin declined, not out of bitterness, out of completion. He had nothing left to say that he hadn't already lived. Later that evening, something small but symbolic occurred. A neighbor, Sandra Mills, early 60s, widow, known for her meticulous garden and general avoidance of drama, walked over from 2 houses down. She didn't carry a pie or cookies or an apology, just a folding chair. She opened it on the edge of Marvin's lawn, placed it next to his rocker, and sat down. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "I didn't know they could do that. I didn't want to believe it when I heard." "They could," Marvin replied. "They did." "Why didn't you leave?" "Because this is where I breathe." She nodded. They sat there until the porch light clicked on. The board didn't recover. By month's end, 3 members resigned. An emergency vote replaced them with interim members, 2 of whom had voted against Karen's override request in the early days, and one who brought in an outside mediator to restructure the bylaws. The term aesthetic standard enforcement was formally suspended. Medical accommodations were given full priority recognition under state compliance law, and all remaining third-party contracts were terminated pending investigation. Karen never returned. Her house sold quietly, off-market, to a private buyer. No one saw her pack. No one said goodbye. But Marvin didn't celebrate. He simply placed a new plaque on the post near his porch where the old false ordinance had once stood. It was brass, modest, and cleanly engraved. Access is not a privilege. Breath is not negotiable. And below it, in smaller script, this home complies with life. The neighborhood had changed. Not fully, not forever, but enough. Enough to remind those who remained that silence could be broken, not with noise, but with clarity. Not with vengeance, but with permanence. Marvin didn't ask for anything more. He just kept breathing. And in that, he won. Months passed, not quickly, but without further interference. The porch, once marked as offensive, unstable, and non-compliant, now stood unchanged, anchored by the same oxygen tank and shaded by the same faded canvas Marvin had installed the day he moved in. It had not become invisible. No, quite the opposite. People saw it now. They noticed it. But they didn't cross the street anymore. They nodded. Some paused. A few even asked quiet, cautious questions, the kind you ask when you're trying to understand something you once thought you didn't need to know. Marvin answered them when he felt like it. He owed no one an explanation, but he gave them clarity when they were ready to receive it. The new board leadership had restructured the neighborhood's operating procedures, though Marvin had no illusion about how deep the change went. Systems don't collapse because they're exposed. They collapse when people stop pretending they can't see them. He didn't expect miracles. But there were no more surprise visits, no sudden outages, no folded notices tucked beneath his mat. The power stayed on. The water pressure remained steady. The tank never had to run on emergency battery again. That, in itself, was something close to peace. One afternoon, while cleaning out an old box from the hall closet, Marvin found the original notice Karen had written, the first attempt to push him into hiding. He smoothed out the creases, held it to the light, and let the absurdity of its tone sit with him. What had once been a veiled threat now felt like a relic, a monument to the polite cruelty of false civility. He didn't shred it. He didn't burn it. He simply slipped it into a folder labeled Resolved and placed it at the back of a cabinet, behind the medical records and the city inspection receipts. His contact at the Office of Regulatory Equity, Erica Thomas, followed up twice. Once by email to confirm that Nova Grid had been suspended pending investigation, and a second time with a short letter mailed directly to Marvin's home. The envelope contained no apology, no dramatic closure, just a line stating that utility companies operating under community contracts would now be required to undergo yearly compliance reviews for residential fairness. His case had prompted a change, not monumental, but tangible. Occasionally, Marvin still saw trucks passing through the neighborhood. New contractors, new logos, unfamiliar faces. None of them approached his house. None of them lingered near the utility boxes. It was enough. He could breathe. The air was changing, not just in temperature but in tone. The people who once whispered now spoke, even if briefly. A woman from the next street over left a jar of tea on his porch with a note, "For your lungs, and for your fight." A teenager riding his bike slowed down to say, "My grandpa has one of those machines. He's tough, like you." Marvin didn't smile often, but in that moment, he felt something he hadn't in years. Recognition without pity, respect without theater. Karen was never heard from again. Her name faded from the newsletters, erased from meeting records, her property quietly resold to a couple who kept to themselves. Marvin never mentioned her, not in conversation, not in memory. She became what she always feared to be, forgotten, powerless. On a late Sunday evening, as dusk settled across the neighborhood, Marvin wheeled a new tank onto the porch. It gleamed, fresh, polished, more compact than the previous model, but just as functional. He placed it carefully beside the chair, locked the wheels, and adjusted the regulator with a precision born of routine. Then he sat, mask fitted, air flowing, and watched the sun dip behind the roofs. Across the street, lights flicked on one by one. Houses settled, windows glowed. No one stared, no one complained. He was just a man on a porch, breathing. He didn't feel victorious. That wasn't the word. But he felt intact, still standing, still present, still alive. And that, in the quiet of twilight, was everything.